Hallihallo meine Lieben, willkommen zurück zu Docsbox Entertainment. Hallihallo, schön, dass ihr alle da seid, freut mich sehr, hi. Dadurch, dass der Stream so spät ist, habe ich mir gedacht, ich nutze das vielleicht gleich, dass es so spät ist und lese euch was vor. Auf Kickstarter gab es eine coole Mission, die ich unterstützt habe, dass sie dieses Buch in schwarzem Leder eingebunden auf Papier, das aus einem italienischen Steinbruch ist, weil das Steinpapier ist. Das hat ein bisschen eine andere Haptik als normales Papier und es ist einfacher auf dem schwarz zu machen und dann mit weißer Tinte drauf zu machen. Deswegen ist das alles in weißer Schrift auf schwarzem Papier. Das ist ziemlich überraschend gut zu lesen. Ich finde es voll entspannend. Also den Titel vom Stream habe ich nicht umsonst auf Englisch gemacht. Das Buch ist tatsächlich Englisch. Natürlich gab es keine deutsche Version von diesem speziellen Buch. Aber für alle, die meine Instagram-Story nicht gesehen haben, ich habe dadurch, dass ich das Projekt auf Kickstarter frühzeitig gebackt habe, bin ich auch hier vorne ist eine Liste mit den ganzen Bäckern und hier auf der letzten Seite stehe ich sogar mit meinem Namen. Dafür stehe ich mit meinem Namen. Es beginnt mit einem Brief von seinem Vater an Viktor Frankenstein. Chapter 4. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. To V. Frankenstein. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date for your return to us. Ja, will sie besuchen. He wants to visit them, right? And I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and gay welcome to behold? On the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs. And how shall I inflict pain on an absent child? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I knew it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible tidings. William is dead, the sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle, yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your two brothers went to walk in Plain Palais. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought to returning, and then we discovered William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernest came, and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that they had been playing together, that William had run away and hid himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and afterwards waited for him a long time, but that he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself and was exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. At first I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted and entered the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and clasping her hands exclaimed, "O God, I have murdered my darling infant." She fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that the same evening William had teased her to let her wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed of our mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him, and present although our exertions to discover him under unremitted. But they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor. You alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually, and accuses herself unjustly, and the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy. But will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother, alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live this witness the cruel, miserably death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding through vengeance against the assassin, but with feeling of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who you love, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and affiliated father, Alphonse Frankenstein. Geneva, May 12th, 1700 blank. We don't know at which period of time this takes place. It just always says 1700 blank blank. Clever, the childhood friend of Victor Frankenstein, who stayed at his place. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded to the joy I at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he when he perceived me weep with bitterness. "Are you always to be unhappy, my dear friend? What has happened?" I motioned to him to take up the letter, while I walked up and down the room in extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," he said. "Your disaster is irreparable. Irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to raise my spirit. He did not do this by common topics of consolation, but by exhibiting the truest sympathy. "Poor William," he said, "that dear child, he now sleeps with his angel brother. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. He does not now feel the murderous grasp. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a fit subject for pity. The survivor are the greatest sufferers, and for them time is the only consolation. Those maxims of the Stoic, that death was not evil, and that the mind of a man ought to be superior to despair on the eternal absence of a beloved object, ought not to be urged. Even Cato wept over the dead body of his brother." Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves into my mind, and I remember them afterwards in solitude. But now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into a cabriole and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends. But when I drew near my native town, I slacked my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years, now altered. How altered everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have by degrees worked other alternations which, although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared not advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I was unable to define them. I remained 2 days in Lausanne in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid. All around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the place of nature, were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear. The sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this not prognostic? Is this not to prognosticate peace, or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friends, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell a delight I took in again holding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake. Yet, as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomingly. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched human being. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environment of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron, the village half a league of the east of the city. The sky was serene, and as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plain Palais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on leaning, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. It advanced. The heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with terrific crash over my head. I was echoed from Sèvres, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightnings dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over the part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Bellerive and the village of Copé. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened sometimes disclosed of Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the storm, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with hasty steps. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral. This is thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature, and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to a humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No. No sooner did the idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against the tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought to pursuing the devil, but I would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Moss Leave, a hill that bounds Plain Palais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget. The whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands, alive at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life, and was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned those loose into the world and depraved wretch, whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent cold and wet in the open air. But did I not feel the inconvenience of the weather? My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done, nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were opened, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer and cause instant pursuit to be made. but I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being who I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipice of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever which I had been seized just at the time that I had dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly impossible. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would allude to all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relative to commence it. Besides, of what use would be pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mont Saleve? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 a.m. when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family and went into the library and attended their usual hour of rising. 6 years has elapsed, passed as a dream, but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved and respectable parents, he still remained to me. I gaze on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was an historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Buffon in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Her garb was rustic, and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive and hastened to welcome me. He expressed a sorrowful delight to see me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," he said. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. But we are now unhappy, and I am afraid tears instead of smiles will be your welcome. Our father looks so sorrowful. His dreadful event seems to have revived in his mind his grief of the death of Mamma. Poor Elizabeth also is quite inconsolable." Ernest begins to weep, and he said these words. "Do not," said I, "welcome me thus. Try to be more calm, that I may not be absolutely miserable the moment I enter my father's house after so long an absence. But tell me, how does my father support his misfortunes, and how is my poor Elizabeth?" "She indeed requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "The murderer has been discovered? Good God! How can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds or confine the mountain stream with a straw." "I do not know what you mean, but we were all very unhappy when she was discovered. No one would believe at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, her last name is Moritz, Justine Moritz was so amiable and fond of all the family, could all at once become so extremely wicked? Justine Moritz? Poor girl. Is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one believes it. Surely, Ernest. No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us. And her own behavior was been confused as to add to the evidence of facts at weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for a doubt. But she will be tried she will be tried today, and you will then hear all. He related that the morning on which the murderer of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed, and after several days, one of the servants happened to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of the servant, instantly shewed it to the one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and upon their deposition Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor good Justine, is innocent." At that instant my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance. Countenance is a word for face, by the way. But he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and after we had exchanged our mournful greetings, would have introduced some other topics than that of our disaster, had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa, Victor said that he knew who was the murderer of poor William." We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for indeed I had rather have been forever ignorant than have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I value so highly." "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent." "If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her, and in this assurance I calmed myself, expecting the trial with eagerness, but without prognostication and evil results. We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had made great alternations in her form since I had last beheld her 6 years before. She had been a pretty, good-humored girl whom everyone loved and caressed. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely, and an open and capacious forehead gave indications of a good understanding, joined to great frankness of disposition. Her eyes were hazel and expressive of mildness, now through recent affliction allied to sadness. Her hair was of a rich dark auburn, her complexion fair, and her figure slight and graceful. She welcomed me with the greeting affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," said she, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means and justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she be convicted of crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost the lovely darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even the worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy no more. But she will not. I am sure she will not. And then I shall be happy again. Even after the sad death of my little William." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind are you! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew that it was impossible. And to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly manner rendered me hopeless and despairing," she wept. "Sweet niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our judges and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." That was chapter 4. I think I would read another chapter, because then it's the end of volume 1. It's about the same length. More. Still not asleep? Then I shall conceive. Chapter 7. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence. My father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses, I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the results of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of 2 of my fellow beings, one a smiling baby, full of innocence and joy, and the other far more dreadful, murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that could make the murder memorable in horror. Justine also was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now, all was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave. And I, the cause. 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crimes ascribed to Justine, but I was absent when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the raving of a madman, and would not have exculpated her who suffered through me. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance was engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and did not tremble, although gazed on her execrated by thousands. For all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. Yes. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evident constrained, and as her confusion had more been adduced as a proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes around it, and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness. Important. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, several witnesses were called. Several strange facts combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who had not such proof of her innocence as I had. She had been out the whole of the night on which she had been out the whole night on which the murder had been committed, and towards morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been afterwards found. The woman asked her what she did there, but she looked very strangely, and only returned a confused and unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had passed the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and demanded earnestly if anything had been heard concerning him. When shewn the body, she fell into violent hysterics, and kept her bed for several days. The picture was then produced, which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which an hour before the child had been missed, she had placed around his neck. A murmur of horror and indignation filled the court. Justine was called on for her defense. As the trial had proceeded, her countenance had altered. Surprise, horror, and misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with her tears, But then she was desired to plead. She collected her powers and spoke in an audible, although variable voice. "God knows," she said, "how entirely I am innocent. But I do not pretend that my protestations should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adduced against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation, where any circumstance appears doubtful or suspicious." She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night on which the murder had been committed at the house of an aunt of Gien, a village situated at about a league from Geneva. On her return, at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account and passed several hours in looking for him. When the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, being unwillingly to call up the inhabitants, to whom she was well known. Unable to rest or sleep, she quitted her asylum early, that she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night, and the fate of poor William was yet uncertain. Concerning the picture, she could give no account. "I know," continued the unhappy victim, "how heavily and fatal this one circumstance weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probability by which I might have been placed in my pocket. But here also I am checked. I believe that I have no enemy on earth, and none surely would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer place it there? I know of no opportunity afforded him for so doing, or if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel to part with it again so soon? I commit my cause to the justice of my judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not overweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, although I would pledge my salvation on my innocence. Several witnesses were called, who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her. But fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resource, her excellent disposition and irreproachable conduct, about to fail the accused, when, although violently agitated, she desired permission to address the court. "I am," she said, "the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since and even long before his birth. I may therefore be judged indecent in me to come forward on the occasion. But when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretended friends, I wish to be allowed to speak." Oh, this is that's the cousin. I'm sorry, wrong voice. "I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, at one time for 5 and another for nearly 2 years. During all of that period, she appeared to me the most amiable and benevolent of human creatures. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness, with the greatest affection and care, and afterwards attended her own mother during the tedious illness, in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her. After which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for such an action, and to the bauble on which the chief proof rests, if she had earnestly desired it, I should have willingly given it to her. So much do I esteem of her value." Excellent, excellent, Elizabeth. A murmur of approbation was heard, but it was excited by the generous interference, and not in favor of Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. She herself wept as Elizabeth spoke, but she did not answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenance of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The torture of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom, and would not forego their hold. I passed a night of unmingled wretchedness. In the morning I went to the court. My lips and throat were parched. I dared not to ask the fatal question, but it was known, and the officer guessed that the cause of my visit. The ballots have been thrown. They were all black, and Justine was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensation of horror, and I have endeavored to bestow upon the adequate expressions, but words cannot convey an idea of the heart-sickening despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed her guilt. That evidence, he observed, was hardly required in so glaring a case, and I am glad of it. And, indeed, none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, be it ever so decisive. When I returned home, Elizabeth eagerly demanded the result. "My cousin," I replied, "it is decided, and you may have expected. All judges had rather than 10 innocent should suffer than that one guilty should escape." But she was confessed. This was a dire blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. "Alas," she said, "how shall I ever gain belief in human benevolence? Justine, whom I loved and esteemed as my sister, how could she put on those smiles of innocence only to betray? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any severity or ill humor, and yet she has committed a murder." Soon after we heard that poor victim had expressed a wish to see my cousin, my father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me. I cannot go alone." The idea of this visit was torture to me, yet I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber, and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the further end. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. She rose on seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself on the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. My cousin wept also. "Oh, Justine," she said, "why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then very, very wretched, I was not miserable as I am now. And do you also believe that I am very, very wicked? Do you also join with my enemies to crush me?" Her voice was suffocated with sobs. "Rise, my poor girl, Elizabeth," said Elizabeth. "Why do you kneel if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding every evidence, until I heard that you had yourself declared your guilt. That report, you say, is false. And be assured, dear Justine, that nothing can shake my confidence in you for a moment, but your own confession." "I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins. The God of heavens forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, My confessor had besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost begun to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretched doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. She paused, weeping, and then continued. I thought with horror, my sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, whom your blessed aunt had so highly honored, and whom you loved, was a creature capable of a crime which none but the devil himself could have perpetrated. Dear William, dearest blessed child, I soon shall see you again in heaven, where we all be happy, and that consoles me, going as I am to suffer ignominy and death. Oh, Justine, forgive me for having one moment distrusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, my dear girl. I will everywhere proclaim your innocence and force belief. Yet you must die. You, my playfellow, my companion, my more than sister. I never can survive so horrible a misfortune. Dear sweet Elizabeth, do not weep. You ought to raise me with thoughts of a better life, and elevate me from the petty cares of this world of injustice and strife. Do not you, excellent friend, drive me to despair. I will try to comfort you, but this, I fear, is an evil too deep, too poignant, and admit of consolation, for there is no hope. Yet heaven bless thee, my dearest Justine, with resignation and a confidence elevated beyond this world. Oh, how I hate its shoot and mockeries. When one creature is murdered, another is immediately deprived of life in a slow, torturing manner. Then the executioners, their hands yet reeking with the blood of innocence, believed that they have done a great deed. They call this retribution. Hateful name. When that word is pronounced, I know greater and more horrid punishments are going to be inflicted than the gloomiest tyrant has ever invented to satiate his utmost revenge. Yet this is not consolation for you, my Justine, unless indeed that you may glory in escaping from so miserable den. Alas, I would I were in peace with my aunt and my lovely William, escape from a world which is hateful to me, and the visages of men which I abhor. Justine smiled languidly. This, my dear lady, is despair, and not resignation. I must not learn the lesson that you would teach me. Talk of something else, something that will bring peace and not increase my misery. During this conversation, I had retired to a corner of the prison room, where I could conceal the horror, anguish that possessed me. despair. Who dared to talk of that? The poor victim, who on the marrow was the past dreary boundary between life and death, felt not as I did such deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, utterly, a groan that came from my inmost soul. Justine started. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, "Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe that I am guilty." I could not answer. "No, Justine." "No, Justine," said Elizabeth. "He is more convinced of your innocence than I was. Even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not credit it." "I truly thank him. In these last moments I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to such a wretch as I am. It removes more than half of my misfortune, and I feel as if I could die in peace now that my innocence is acknowledged by you, dear lady, and you, her cousin." Thus the poor sufferer tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was unhappy, but hers also was the misery of innocence, which, like a cloud that passes over the fair moon, was for a while hides, but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth could tear herself away. "I wish," she cried, "that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty represented her bitter tears. She repressed her bitter tears. She embraced Elizabeth and said in a voice of half-suppressed emotions, "Farewell, sweet lady, dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend. May heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune that you will ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so." As we returned, Elizabeth said, "You know not, my dear Victor, how much I am relieved now that I trust in the innocence of this unfortunate girl. I never could again have known peace if I had been deceived in my reliance on her. For the moment that I did believe her guilty, I felt an anguish that I could not have long sustained. Now my heart is lightened. The innocent suffers, but she, whom I thought amiable and good, has not betrayed the trust I reposed on her, and I am consoled. Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice. But I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. End of volume 1. Miss Moritz was sentenced to death. And so Elizabeth was mourning about her, mourning for her. Justine met justice. Or injustice, how you want to see it. And in the last chapter, they were just climbing up a mountain to distract themselves. Nothing really happened. So we're at Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, Volume 2, Chapter 2. The next day, contrary to the prognostications. Contrary to the prognostications of our guides, was fine, although clouded. Oh, they're still climbing the mountain. Okay. We visited the source of the Arviran and rode about the valley until evening. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. In some degree, also, they diverted my mind from the thoughts over which I had brooded for the last month. I returned in the evening, fatigued, but less unhappy, and conversed with my family with more cheerfulness than had been my custom for some time. My father was pleased, and Elizabeth overjoyed. "My dear cousin," she said, "you see what happiness you diffuse when you are happy. Do not relapse again." The following morning, the rain poured down in torrents, and thick mists hid the summits of the mountains. I rose early, but felt unusual melancholy. The rain depressed me, my old feelings recurred, and I was miserable. I knew how disappointed my father would be at this sudden change, and I wished to avoid him until I had recovered myself so far as to be enabled to conceal those feelings that overpowered me. I knew that they would remain that day and the inn, and as I had ever endured myself to rain, moisture, and cold, I resolved to go alone to the summit of Montanvert. I remembered the effort. I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. By the way, a big recommendation of mine, Glacier by Devin Townsend. Incredible good song. That's not in the book, that's my personal recommendation. It had then filled me with the sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sigh of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life. I determined to go alone, for I was well acquainted with the path, and presence of another would destroy the solitary grandeur of the scene. The ascent is precipitous, but the path is cut into continual and short windings, which enable you to surmount the perpendicularity of the mountain. It is a scene terrific. Oh, Jesus, Maria und Josef. Rest it on Mary Shelley, really. It is a scene terrifically desolated. In 1,000 spots, the traces of the winter avalanches may be perceived, where trees lie broken and strewed on the ground, some entirely broken, others bent, leaning upon the jutting rocks of the mountain or transversely upon the trees. The path, as you ascend higher, is intersected with ravines of snow, down with stones continually rolling from above. One of them is particularly dangerous, as the slightest sound, such as even speaking in a loud voice, produces a concussion of air sufficient to draw destruction upon the head of the speaker. The pines are not tall or luxuriant, but they are somber, and add an air of severity to the scene. I looked on the valley beneath. Vast mists were rising, and the rivers which ran through it, and curling in thick wreaths around the opposite mountain, whose summit were hid in the uniform clouds, while rain poured from the dark sky and added to the melancholy impression I received from the objects around me. Alas, why does that boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulse were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and the chance word of scene that the word may convey to us. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel conceived, or reason, laugh or weep, embrace found woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er been like this morrow. Naught may endure by mutability. It was nearly noon when I arrived at the top of the ascent. For some time I sat upon the rocks that overlooked the sea of ice. A mist covered both that and the surrounding mountains. Presently a breeze dissipated the clouds and descended upon the glacier. The surface is very uneven, rising like the waves of a troubled sea, descending low and interspersed by rifts that sink deep. The field of ice is almost a league in width, but I spent nearly 2 hours in crossing it. The opposite mountain is a bare, perpendicular rock. From the side where I now stood, Montavert was exactly opposite, at the distance of a league, and above it rose Mont Blanc, in awful majesty. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, would, among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before so sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion, away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man, at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of a human. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me. But I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach, and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for a human eye. But I scarcely observed this. Anger and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil," I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wrecked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust. And, oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expect this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, whom thou art bound by these ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them, and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death, until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." "Abhorred monster, fiend of thou art,
The torture of hell are too mild a vengeance for thy crimes. Wretched devil, you approach me with your creation. Come on then, that I may extinguish the sparks which I so neglectingly bestowed. My rage was without bounds. I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can arm one being against the existence of another. He easily eluded me and said, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me before you give me vent to your hatred on my beloved head. Have I not suffered enough that you speak to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. Remember, thou hast made me more powerful than thyself. My height is superior to thine, my joints more supple, but I will not be trampled. To set myself in opposition to thee. I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king. If thou wilt also perform thy art, the which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irreversible excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Begone. I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Begone, for let us try our strength in a fight in which one must fall. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon my creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But I am not alone, miserably alone. You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures, who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. They desert mountains, and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are dwelling to me, and the only one which me does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do, and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not then hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. Yet it is in my power to recompense me and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed, by human laws, bloody as they may be, to speak in their own defense before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accused me of a murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of men. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me. And then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. Why do you call my remembrance circumstances of which I shudder to reflect, that I have been the miserable origin of this author? Cursed be the day, abhorrent devil, in which you first saw light. Cursed, although I curse myself, be the hands that formed you. You have made me wretched beyond expression. You have left me no power to consider whether I am just to you or not. Begone! Relieve me from this sight of your detested form. Thus I relieve thee, my creator, he said, and placed his hated hands before my eyes, which I flung from me with violence. Thus I take from thee a sight which you abhor. Still thou canst listen to me, and grant me thy compassion. By the virtues that I once possessed, I demand this from you. Hear my tale. It is long and strange, and the temperature of this place is not fitting for your fine sensations. Come to the hut upon the mountain. The sun is yet high in the heavens, before it descends to hide itself behind yon snowy precipice and illuminate another world. You will have heard my story and can decide. On you it rests whether I quit forever the neighborhood of men and lead a harmless life, or become the scourge of your fellow creatures and the author of your own speedy ruin. As he said this, he led the way across the ice. I followed. My heart was full, and I did not answer him. But as I proceeded, I weighed the various arguments that he had used, and determined at least to listen to his tale. I was partly urged by curiosity, and compassion confirmed my resolution. I had hitherto supposed him to be the murderer of my brother, and I eagerly sought a confirmation or denial of his opinion. For the first time, also, I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. These motives urged me to comply with his demand. We crossed the ice, therefore, and ascended the opposite rock. The air was cold. The rain again began to descend. We entered the hut, the fiend with an air of exultation, I with a heavy heart and depressed spirits. But I consented to listen, and seating myself by the fire, which my odious companion had lighted, he thus began his tale. End of chapter 2. One more song. How long is the next chapter? 1, 2, 3. About the same as this one. Yeah, let's do that. Let's hear the tale of Frankenstein's monster. Chapter 3. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of the period appeared confused and distinct and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt all at the same time. And it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. By degrees, I remembered a strong light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me. But hardly had I felt this, when by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me. I walked, and I believe descended, but I presently found a great alternation in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but I now found that I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearing me as I walked. I sought a place where I could revise shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook, resting from my fatigue, until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my nearly dormant state, and I ate some berries which I found hanging on the trees or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then, lying down, was overcome by sleep. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold also, and half frightened, as it were, instinctively finding myself too desolate. Before I had quitted your apartment on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. Soon a gentle light stole over the heavens and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up and beheld a radiant form rise from among the trees. I gazed with a kind of wonder. It moved slowly, but it enlightened my path, and I again went out in search of berries. I was still cold when under one of the trees I found a huge cloak, with which I covered myself and sat down upon the ground. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. All was confused. I felt light and hunger and thirst and darkness. Innumerable sounds rung in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure. Several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. I gradually saw plainly the clear stream that supplied me with drink, and the trees that shaded me with their foliage. I was delighted when I first discovered that a pleasant sound which often saluted my ears proceeded from the throats of a little winged animal who had often intercepted the light from my eyes. I began also to observe with greater accuracy the forms that surrounded me, and to perceive the boundaries of the radiant roof of light which canopied me. Sometimes I tried to imitate the pleasant songs of the birds, but was unable. Sometimes I wished to express my sensations in my own mode, but the uncouth and inarticulate sounds which broke from me frightened me into silence again. The moon had disappeared from the night, and again with a lessened form shewed itself, while I still remained in the forest. My sensations had by this time become distinct, and my mind received every day additional ideas. My eyes became accustomed to the light, and to perceive objects in their right forms. I distinguished the insect from the herb, and by degrees one herb from another. I found that the sparrow uttered none but harsh notes, whilst those of the blackbird and thrush were sweet and enticing. One day, when I was oppressed by cold, I found a fire which had been left by some wandering beggars, and was overcome with delight at the warmth I experienced from now. In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live ember, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. I examined the materials of the fire, and to my joy found it to be composed of wood. I quickly collected some branches, but they were wet and would not burn. I was pained at this, and sat still, watching the operation of the fire. The wet wood, which I had placed near the heat, dried, and itself became inflamed. I reflected on this, and by touching the various branches, I discovered the cause, and busied myself in collecting a great quantity of wood, that I might dry it, and have a plentiful supply of fire. When the night came, and brought sleep with it, I was in the greatest fear lest my fire should be extinguished. I covered it carefully with dry wood and leaves, and placed the wet branches upon it, and then spread my cloak. I lay on the ground and sunk into sleep. It was morning when I woke, and the first care was to visit my fire. I uncovered it, and a gentle breeze quickly fanned it into flames. I observed this, and contrived a fan of branches, which roused the embers when they were nearly extinguished. When night came again, I found with pleasure that the fire gave light as well as heat, and that the discovery of this element was useful to me in my food, for I found some of these offals that the travelers had left had been roasted and toasted, much more savory than the berries I gathered from the trees. I tried, therefore, to dress my food in the same manner, glazing it on the live ember. I found that the berries were spoiled by this operation, and the nuts and roots much improved. Food, however, became scarce, and I often spent the whole day searching in vain for a few acorns to assuage the pangs of hunger. When I found this, I resolved to quit the place, and I had hitherto inhabited, to seek for one where the few wants I experienced would be more easily satisfied. In this emigration, I exceedingly lamented the loss of the fire which I had obtained through accident, and knew not how to reproduce it. I gave several hours to the serious consideration of this difficulty, but I was obliged to relinquish all attempt to supply it, and, wrapping myself up in my cloak, I struck across the wood towards the setting sun. I passed 3 days in these rambles, and at length discovered the open country. A great fall of snow had taken place the night before, and the fields were of one uniform white. The appearance was disconsolated, and I found my feet chilling by the cold, damp substance that covered the ground. It was about 7 in the morning, and I longed to obtain food and shelter. At length I perceived a small hut on a rising ground, which had sight to me, and which had doubtless been built for the convenience of some shepherd. This was a new sight to me, and I examined the structure with great curiosity. Finding the door open, I entered. An old man sat in it, near a fire, over which he was preparing his breakfast. He turned on hearing a noise, and perceiving me, he shrieked loudly, and quitting the hut, ran across the fields with a speed of which his debilitated form hardly appeared capable. His appearance differed from any I had ever seen before, and his flight somewhat surprised me. But I was enchanted by the appearance of the hut. Here the snow and rain could not penetrate. The ground was dry, and it presented to me then as exquisite and divine a retreat as pandemonium appeared to the demons of hell after their suffering in the lake of fire. I greedily devoured the remnants of the shepherd's breakfast, which consisted of bread, cheese, milk, and wine. The latter, however, I did not like. Then, overcome by fatigue, I lay down amongst straw and fell asleep. It was noon when I woke, and allured by the warmth of the sun, which shone brightly on the white ground, I determined to recommence my travels, and depositing the remains of the peasant's breakfast in the wallet I found, I proceeded across the fields for several hours, until at sunset I arrived at a village. How miraculously did that appear! The huts, the neater cottages, and stately houses engaged my admiration by turns. The vegetables in the gardens, the milk and cheese that I saw placed at the windows of some of the cottages allured my appetite. One of the best of these I entered, but I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons. I escaped to the open country, and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel. Quite escaped to the open country. To open country, and fearfully looked refuge in a low hovel, quite bare and making a wretched appearance after the places I had beheld in the village. This hovel, however, joined a cottage of a neat and pleasant appearance, but after my late dearly bought experience, I dared not to enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could with difficulty sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth which formed the floor, but it was dry, and although the wind entered it by innumerable chinks, I found it an agreeable asylum for the snow and rain. Here then I retreated and lay down, happy to have found a shelter, however miserable from the inclemence of the season, and still more from the barbarity of men. As soon as morning dawned, I crept from my kennel, that I might view the adjacent cottage, and discovered if I could remain in the habitation I had found. It was situated against the back of the cottage, and surrounded on the sides were exposed by a pigsty and clear pool of water. One part was open, and by that I had crept it, but now I recover every crevice by which I might be perceived with stones and wood, yet in such a manner that I might move them on occasion to pass out. All the light I enjoyed came through the sty and that was sufficient for me. Having thus arranged my dwelling and carpeted it with clean straw, I retired. For I saw the figure of a man at a distance, and I remembered too well my treatment the night before to trust myself in his power. I had first, however, provided for my sustenance for the day by a loaf of coarse bread, which I purloined, and a cup with which I could drink, more conveniently than from my hands. Of the pure water which flowed by my retreat. The floor was a little raised, so that it was kept perfectly dry, and by its vicinity to the chimney of the cottage it was tolerable warm. Being thus provided, I resolved to reside in the hovel until something should occur which might alter my determination. It was indeed a paradise compared to the bleak forest, my former residence, the rain-dropping branches and dark earth. I ate my breakfast with pleasure, and was about to remove a plank to procure myself a little water, when I heard a step, and looking through a small chink, I beheld a young creature with a pail on her head, passing before my hovel. The girl was young and of gentle demeanor, unlike what I have since found cottagers and farmhouses servants to be. Yet she was meanly dressed, and a coarse blue petticoat, and a linen jacket being her only garb. Her fair hair was plaited, but not adorned. She looked patient, yet sad. I lost sight of her, and in about a quarter of an hour she returned, bearing the pail, which was now partly filled with milk. As she walked along, seemingly incommoded by the burden, a young man met her, whose countenance expressed a deeper despondence. Uttering a few sounds with an air of melancholy, he took the pail from her hand and bore it to the cottage himself. She followed, and they disappeared. Presently I saw the young man again, with some tools in his hand, cross the field, being the cottage, and the girl was also busied, sometimes in the house and sometimes in the yard. On examining my dwelling, I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood. In one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink, through which the eye could just penetrate. Through this crevice, a small room was visible, whitewashed and clean, but very bare of furniture. In one corner, near a small fire, sat an old man, leaning his head on his hands in a disconsolated attitude. The young girl was occupied in arranging the cottage, but presently she took something out of the drawer, which employed her hands, and she sat down beside the old man, who, taking up an instrument, began to play and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush of the nightingale, or the nightingale. It was a lovely sight, even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet, mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice, until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her, and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensation of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. Soon after this, the young man returned, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl met him at the door, helped to relieve him of his burden, and asked some of the fuel into taking some of the fuel into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart into the nook of the cottage, and he shewed her a large loaf and a piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water and then upon the fire. She afterwards continued her work, whilst the young man went into the garden and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. After he had been employed thus about an hour, the young woman joined him, and they entered the cottage together. The old man had in the meantime been pensive, but on the appearance of his companions, he assumed a more cheerful air, and they sat down to eat. The meal was quickly dispatched. The young woman was again occupied in arranging the cottage. The old man walked before the cottage and the son for a few minutes, leaning on the arm of the youth. Nothing could exceed the beauty and the contrast between these two excellent creatures. One was old, with silver hair, and a countenance beaming with benevolence and love. The younger was slight and graceful in his figure, and his features were molded with the finest symmetry. Yet his eyes and attitude expressed the utmost sadness and despondence. The old man returned to the cottage, and the youth, with tools different from those he had used in the morning, directed his steps across the fields. Night quickly shut in, but to my extreme wonder, I found that the cottagers had a means of prolonging light by the use of the tapers, and was delighted to find that the setting of the sun did not put an end to the pleasure I experienced in watching my human neighbors. In the evening, the young girl and her companion were employed in various occupations which I did not understand, and the old man again took up the instrument, which produced the divine sounds that had enchanted me in the morning. So soon as he had finished, the youth began not to play, but to utter sounds that were monotonous, and neither resembling the harmony of the old man's instrument, or the songs that the birds, I since found that that he read aloud, but at that time I knew nothing of the signs of words or letters. The family, after having been thus occupied for a short time, extinguished their light and retired, as I conjectured, to rest. End of chapter 3. We are at chapter 5 of book number 2, where the monster, Frankenstein's monster, is telling his past, what has happened in the time since his creation to up to the point, because it's been about a year. And for what I recall, he was banished from a town by the people because he's fucking ugly. He's fugly, if you want. Schön. Und and he found a shelter, a house of 3 farmers and a family. An old guy with 2 children, I guess. And the 2 are making pharmacy. The 2 children are farmers. And he's watching them through the creaks of the shed behind the house he's living in. And he also helps them a lot. He gathers wood and helps them without them noticing him. And so they think it's a good spirit helping them. And that's pretty beautiful for a fugly creature like him, which was banished from everyone else, and they are just like, oh my god, it must be a good spirit helping us. And he's just like, yeah, thank you. And here we are. Chapter 5. I now hasten to the more moving part of my story. I shall relate events that impressed me with feelings which, from what I was, have made me what I am. Spring advanced rapidly, the weather became fine, and the skies cloudless. It surprised me that what before was desert and gloomy should now bloom with the most beautiful flowers and verdure. My senses were gratified and refreshed by 1,000 scents of delight and 1,000 sighs of beauty. It was on one of these days, when my cottagers periodically rested from labor. The old man played on his guitar, and the children listened to him. I observed that the countenance of Felix was melancholy beyond expression. He sighed frequently, and once his father paused his music, and I conjectured by his manner that he inquired the cause of his son's sorrow. Felix replied in a cheerful accent, and the old man was recommencing his music, when someone tapped at the door. It was a lady on horseback, accompanied by a countryman as a guide. The lady was dressed in a dark suit and covered with a thick black veil. Agatha asked a question, to which the stranger only replied by pronouncing in sweet accent, the name of Felix. Her voice was musical, but unlike that of either of my friends. On hearing his words, Felix came up hastily to the lady, who, when she saw him, threw up her veil and beheld a countenance of angelic beauty and expression. Her hair of shining raven black and curiously braided. Her eyes were dark but gentle, although animated. Her features of a regular proportion, and her complexion wondrously fair, each cheek tinged with a lovely pink. Felix seemed ravished with delight when he saw her. Every trait of sorrow vanished from his face, and it instantly expressed a degree of ecstatic joy of which I could hardly have believed it capable. His eyes sparkled as his cheek flushed with pleasure. And at that moment I thought him as beautiful as the stranger. He appeared affected by different feelings, wiping a few tears from his lovely eyes. She held out her hand to Felix, who kissed it rapturously, and called her, as well as I could distinguish, his sweet Arabian. She did not appear to understand him, but smiled. He assisted her to dismount, and, dismissing her guide, conducted her into the cottage. Some conversations took place between him and his father, and the young stranger knelt at the old man's feet and would have kissed his hand, but he raised her and embraced her affectionately. I soon perceived that although the stranger uttered articulated sounds and appeared to have a language of her own, she was neither understood by or herself understood the cottagers. They made many signs which I did not comprehend, but I saw that her presence diffused gladness through the cottage, dispelling her sorrow as the sun dissipates the morning mists. Felix seemed peculiarly happy, and with smiles of delight welcomed his Arabian. Agatha, the ever gentle Agatha, kissed the hand of the lovely stranger, and pointing to her brother, made signs which appeared to me to mean that he had been so sorrowful until she came. Some hours passed thus, while they, by the countenance, expressed joy, the cause of which I did not comprehend. Presently I found, by the frequent recurrence of one sound, which the strangers repeated after them, that she was endeavoring to learn their language, and the idea instantly occurred to me that I should make use of the same instructions to the same end. The strangers learned about 20 words, and at the first lesson, most of them indeed were those which I had before understood, but I profited by the others. As night came on, Agatha and the Arabian retired early. When they separated, Felix kissed the hand of the stranger and said, "Good night, sweet Safie." He sat up much longer, conversing with his father, and by the frequent repetition of her name, I conjectured that their lovely guest was the subject of the conversation. I ardently desired to understand them, and bent every faculty towards that purpose, but found it utterly impossible. The next morning, Felix went out of his work, And after the usual occupations of Agatha were finished, the Arabian sat at the feet of the old man, and taking his guitar, played some airs so entrancingly beautiful, that they at once drew tears of sorrow and delight from my eyes. She sang, and her voice flowed in a rich cadence, swelling or dying away like a nightingale of the woods. When she had finished, she gave the guitar to Agatha, who at first declined it. She played a simple air, and her voice accompanied it in sweet accents, but unlike the wondrous strain of the stranger. The old man appeared enraptured, and said some words which Agatha endeavored to explain to Safie, and by which he appeared to wish to express that she bestowed on him the greatest delight by her music. The days now passed as peaceably as before, with the sole alteration of joy had taken place of sadness in the countenance of my friends. Safie was always gay and happy. She and I improved rapidly in the knowledge of language, so that in 2 months I began to comprehend most of the words uttered by the protectors. In the meanwhile, also the black ground was covered with herbage, and the green banks interspersed with innumerable flowers, sweet to the scent, and the eyes, stars of pale radiance among the moonlight woods. The sun became warmer, the nights clear and balmy, and my nocturnal rambles were an extreme pleasure to me, although they were considerably shortened by the late setting and early rising of the sun, for I never ventured abroad during daylight, fearful of meeting with the same treatment as I had formerly endured in the first village which I entered. My days were spent in close attention, that I might more speedily master the language, and I may boast that I improved more rapidly than the Arabian, who understood very little, and conversed in broken accents, whilst I comprehended and could imitate almost every word that was spoken. While I improved in speech, I also learned the science of letters, as it was taught to the strangers, and this opened before me a wide field of wonder and delight. The book from which Felix instructed Safie was Volney's Ruins of Empires. I should not have understood the purport of this book had not Felix, in reading it, given very minute explanations. He had chosen his work, he said, because the declamatory style was framed in imitation of the Eastern authors. Through this work, I obtained a cursory knowledge of history and a view of the several empires at present existing in the world. It gave me an insight into the manners, governments, and religions of the different nations of the earth. I heard of the slothful Asiatics, of the stupendous genius and mental activities of the Grecians, of the wars, of the wonderful virtue of the early Romans, of their subsequent degeneration, of the decline of the mighty empire, of chivalry, Christianity, and kings, I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Safie over the hapless fate of the original inhabitants. These wonderful narrations inspired me with strange feelings. Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? He appeared at one time a mere scion of the evil principle, and at another as all that can be conceived of noble and godlike. To be a great and virtuous man appeared the highest honor that can befall a sensitive being. To be base and vicious, as many on record have been, appeared the lowest the lowest degradation, a condition more abject than that of the blind mole or harmless worm. For a long time I could not conceive how one man could go forth to murder his fellow, or even why there was laws and governments, but when I heard details of vice and bloodshed, my wonder ceased, and I turned away with disgust and loathing. Every conversation of the cottagers now opened new wonders to me, while I listened to the instructions which Felix bestowed upon the Arabian. The strange system of human society was explained to me. I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank, descent, and noble blood. The words induced me to turn towards myself. I learned that the possession most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and insolite descent united with riches. A man might be respected with only one of these acquisitions, but without either, he was considered, except in very rare instances, as a vagabond and a slave, doomed to waste his powers for the profit of the chosen few. And what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even the same nature as a man. I was more agile than they. I could subside upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known to felt beyond the sensation of hunger, thirst, and heat. Of what a strange nature is knowledge. It clings to the mind when it has once seized on it, like a lichen on the rock. I wished sometimes to shake off all thoughts and feelings, but I learned that there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death, a state which I feared yet did not understand. I admired virtue and good feelings, and loved the gentle manners of the amiable qualities of my cottagers, but I was shut out from intercourse with them, except through means which I obtained by stealth, when I was unseen and unknown, and which rather increased than satisfied the desire I had of becoming one among my fellows. The gentle words of Agatha and the animated smile of the charming Arabian were not for me. The mild exhortations of the old man and the lively conversations of the loved Felix were not for me. Miserable, unhappy wretch. Other lessons were impressed upon me even more deeply. I heard of the difference of sexes, of the birth and growth of children, how the father doted on the smiles of the infant and the lively sallies of the older child, how all the lives and cares of the mother were wrapped up in the precious charge, how the mind of youth expanded and gained knowledges of brothers, sisters, and all the various relationships which bind one human being to another in natural bonds. But where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days. No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses. Or if they had, all my past life was now a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. From my earliest remembrance, I had been as I then was in height and proportion. I had never yet seen a being resembling me, or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I? The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. I will soon explain to what these feelings tended, but allow me now to return to the cottagers, whose story excited in me so much various feelings of indignation, delight, and wonders, but which all terminated in additional love and reverence for my protectors. For so I loved, in an innocent, half painful self-deceit, to call them. Chapter 6. Some time elapsed before I learned the history of my friends. It was one which could not fail to impress itself deeply on my mind, unfolding as I did a number of circumstances, each interesting and wonderful to one so utterly inexperienced as I was. The name of the old man was de Lacy. He was descended from a good family in France. where he had lived for many years in affluence, respected by his superiors and beloved by his equals. His son was bred in the service of his country, and Agatha had ranked with ladies of the highest distinction. A few months before my arrival, they had lived in a large and luxurious city called Paris, surrounded by friends and possessed of every enjoyment which virtue, a refinement of intellect, or taste, accompanied by a moderate fortune, could afford. The father of Safie had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant and had inhabited Paris for many years, when, for some reason which I could not learn, he became obnoxious to the government. He was seized and cast into prison the very day that Safie arrived from Constantinople to join him. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was very flagrant. All Paris was indignant. And it was judged that his religion and wealth, rather than the crime alleged against him, had been the cause of his condemnation. Felix had been present at the trial. His horror and indignation were uncontrollable when he heard the decision of the court. He made at that moment a solemn vow to deliver him, and then looked around for the means. After many fruitless attempts to gain admittance to the prison, he found a strongly grated window in an unguarded part of the build, which lighted the dungeon of the unfortunate Mahometan, who, loaded with chains, waited in despair the execution of the barbarous sentence. Felix visited the grate at night and made known to the prisoner his intentions in his favor. The Turk, amazed and delighted, endeavored to kindle the zeal of his deliverer by promises of rewards and wealth. Felix rejected his offers with contempt. Yet, when he saw the lovely Safie, who was allowed to visit her father, and who by her gestures expressed her lively gratitude, the youth could not help owning to his own mind that the captive possessed a treasure which would fully reward his toil and hazard. The Turk quickly perceived the impression that his daughter had made on the heart of Felix, and endeavored to secure him more entirely in his interest by the promise of her hand in marriage. So soon as he should be conveyed to a place of safety, Felix was too delicate to accept his offer, yet he looked forward to the probability of that event as to the consummation of his happiness. During the ensuing days, while the preparations were going forward for the escape of the merchant, the zeal of Felix was warmed by several letters that he received from his lovely girl, who found means to express her thoughts in the language of her love by the aid of an old man, a servant of her father's, who understood French. She thanked him in the most ardent terms of his intended services towards her father,
and at the same time she gently deplored her own fate. I have copies of the letters, for I found means during my residence in the hovel to procure the implements of writing, and the letters were often in the hands of Felix and Agatha before I depart. Before I depart, I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. But at present, as the sun is already far declined, I shall only have time to repeat the substance of them to you. Safie related that her mother was a Christian Arab, seized and made a slave by the Turks. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safie. By her beauty, she had won the heart of the father of Safie. Safie's mother. Yeah, okay. Who married her. Yeah. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Mahomet. The lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed on the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia, and the being immured within the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with puerile amusement, ill-suited for the temper of her soul, now accustomed to grand ideas and a noble emulation of virtue. The prospect of marriage marrying Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society was enchanting to her. The day for the execution of the Turk was fixed, but on the night previous to it he had quitted prison, and before morning was distant many leagues from Paris. Felix had procured passport in the name of his father, sister, and himself. He had previously communicated his plan to the former, who aided the deceit by quitting his house under the pretense of a journey, and concealed himself with his daughter in an obscure part of Paris. Felix conducted the fugitive through the France to Lyon and across Mont-Cenis to Leghorn, where the merchant had decided to wait a favorable opportunity of passing into some part of the Turkish dominions. Safie resolved to remain with her father until the moment of his departure, before which time the Turk renewed his promise that she should be united to his deliverer, and Felix remained with them in expectation of the event, and in the meantime he enjoyed the society of the Arabian, who exhibited towards him the simplest and tenderest affection. They conversed with one another through the means of an interpreter, and sometimes with the interpretation of looks, and Safie sang to him the divine airs of her native country. The Turk allowed this intimacy to take place, and encouraged the hopes of a youthful love, while in his heart he had formed far other plans. He loathed the idea that his daughter should be united with a Christian, but he feared the resentment of Felix would if he should appear lukewarm. For he knew that he was still in the power of his deliverer if he should choose to betray him to the Italian state which they inhabited. He resolved 1,000 plans by which he should be enabled to prolong the deceit until it might be no longer necessary, and secretly to take his daughter with him when he departed. His plans were greatly facilitated by the news which arrived from Paris. The government of France were greatly enraged at the escape of their victim, and spared no pain at the escape of their victims, and spared no pain to detect and punish his deliverer. The plot of Felix was quickly discovered, and de Lacy, French, de Lacy, and Agatha were thrown into prison. The news reached Felix and roused him from his dream of pleasure. His blind and aged father and his gentle sister lay in a noisome dungeon, while he enjoyed the free air and the society of her whom he loved. This idea was torture to him. He quickly arranged with the Turk that if the latter should find a favorable opportunity to escape before Felix could return to Italy, Safie should remain as a boarder at a convent at Leghorn, and then, quitting the lovely Arabian, he hasted to Paris and delivered himself up to the vengeance of the law, hoping to free de Lacy and Agatha by this proceeding. He did not succeed. They remained confined for 5 months before the trial took place, the result of which deprived them of their fortune and condemned them to a perpetual exile from their native country. They found a miserable asylum in the cottage of Germany, where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the treacherous Turk, for whom he and his family endured such unheard of oppression, on discovering that his deliverer was thus reduced to poverty and impotence, became a traitor to good feeling and honor, and had quitted Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a pittance of money to aid him, as he said, in some plan of future maintenance. Such were the events that preyed on the heart of Felix, and rendered him, when I first saw him, the most miserable of his family. He could have endured poverty, and when his distress had been the meed of his virtue, he would have gloried in it. But the ingratitude of the Turk and the loss of his beloved Safie were misfortunes more bitter and irreparable. The arrival of the Arabian now infused new life into his soul. When the news reached Leghorn that Felix was deprived of his wealth and rank, the merchant commanded his daughter to think no more of her love, but to prepare to return with him to her native country. The generous nature of Safie was outraged by this command. She attempted to expostulate with her father, but he left her angrily, reiterating his tyrannical mandate. A few days later, the Turk entered his daughter's apartment and told her hastily that he had reasons to believe that his residence at Leghorn had been divulged, and that he should speedily be delivered up to French government. He had consequently hired a vessel to convey him to Constantinople, for which city he should sail in a few hours. He intended to leave his daughter under the care of a confidential servant, to follow at her leisure with the greater part of his property, which had not yet arrived at Leghorn. When alone, Safie resolved in her own mind the plan of conduct that it would become her to pursue in this emergency. A residence in Turkey was abhorrent to her. Her religion and feelings were alike adverse to it. By some papers of the father's, which fell into her hands, she heard of the exile of her lover, and learned the name of the spot where he then resided. She hesitated some time, but at length she formed her determination. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her, and a small sum of money, she quitted Italy with an attendant, a native of Leghorn, but who understood the common language of Turkey and the departed of Germany. She arrived in safety at the town about 20 leagues from the cottage of Delacy. When her attendants fell dangerously ill, Safie nursed her with the most devoted affection, but the poor girl died, and the Arabian was left alone, unacquainted with the language of the country and utterly ignorant of the customs of the world. She fell, however, into good hands. The Italian had mentioned the name of the spot for which they were bound, and after her death, the woman of the house in which they had lived took care that Safie should arrive in safety at the cottage of her lover. End of chapter 6.
Last time we were, the story was about the cottagers and why they were in the cottage, because they were French people and expelled, exiled from France, and the woman which came to them was the daughter of the salesman that actually owed them something for freeing him, but he never held his promise. But the daughter came back in love to the boy of the family. Yep, that's where we are. Chapter 7. Such was the history of my beloved cottagers. It impressed me deeply. I learned from the views of social life, which I developed, to admire their virtues and to deprecate the vice of mankind. And yet, as yet I looked upon crime as a distant evil, benevolent and generosity were ever present before me, inciting within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene where so many admirable qualities were called forth and displayed. But in giving an account of progress of my intellect, I must not omit a circumstance which occurred in the beginning of the month of August of the same year. One night during my accustomed visits to the neighboring wood, where I collected my own food and brought home firing for the protectors, I found on the ground a leathern portemonnaie. Montu. Oh mein Gott, wie schreibt man Portemonnaie? Na, sicher nicht so. Portmanteau. 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 Ist es ein stummes T? Alles, was ich über Französisch geklaut habe, das ist weg. Egal. Containing several articles of dress and some book. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, the books were written in the language, the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Life, and A Sorrow of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories, whilst my friends were employed in the ordinary occupations. I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. In the sorrows of Werther, besides the interest of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed, and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto been to me obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. The gentle and domestic manners it described, combined with softly sentiments and feelings which had for the object sometimes something out of self, loftily sentiments and something out of self accorded well with my experience among my protectors, and with the wants which were forever a line in my own bosom. But I thought Werther himself a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sunk deep. The disquisitions upon death and suicide were calculated to fill me with wonder. I did not pretend to enter into the merits of the case, yet I inclined towards the opinions of the hero, whose extinction I wept, without precisely understanding it. As I read, however, I applied much personality to my own feelings and conditions. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike the beings concerning whom I read, and to whose conversation I was listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was unfortunately in mind. I was dependent on none and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none of lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. The volume of Plutarch's life, which I possessed, contained the history of the first founders of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me from the sorrows of Werther. I learned from Werther's imaginations despondency and gloom, but Plutarch, taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflection to admire and love the heroes of past ages. Many things I read surpassed my understanding and experience. I had a very confused knowledge of kingdoms, wide extents of country, mighty rivers, and boundless seas. But I was perfectly unacquainted with towns and large assemblages of men. The cottage of my protectors had been the only school in which I had studied human nature, but this book developed new and mightier scenes of action. I read of men concerned in public affairs governing or massacring their species. I felt the great ardor for virtue rise within me, and abhorrence for vice, as far as I understood the signification of those terms. Relative as they were, as I applied them to pleasure and pain alone. Induced by these feelings, I was of course led to admire peaceable lawgivers, Numa, Solon, and Lycurgus, in preference of Romulus and Theseus. The patriarchal lives of my protectors caused these impressions to take a firm hold on my mind. Perhaps, if my first introduction to humanity had been made by a young soldier burning for glory and slaughter, I should have been imbued with different sensations. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonders and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of existing. I often referred the several situations as their similarity struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was created apparently united by no link to any other being in existence. But his state was far different from mine in every other aspect. He had come forth from the hand of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition. For often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Another circumstance strengthened and confirmed these feelings. Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress, which I had taken from your laboratory. At first, I had neglected them, but now I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written. I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. This history has mingled with accounts of domestic occurrences. You, doubtless, recollect these papers. Here they are. Everything is related in them, which bears reference to my accursed origin. The whole detail of that series of disgusting circumstances which produced it is set in view. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given, in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine ineffectible. I sickened as I read. Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Cursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid from its very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils, to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and detested. These were the reflections of my hours of despondency and solitude. But when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers, their amiable and benevolent dispositions, I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me and overlook my personal deformity. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? I resolved at last not to despair, but in every way to fit myself for an interview with them which would decide my fate. I postponed this attempt for some months longer, for the importance attached to its success inspired me with a dread lest I should fail. Besides, I found that my understanding improved so much with every day's experience, that I was unwilling to commence this undertaking until a few months should have added to my wisdom. Several changes in the meantime took place in the cottage. The presence of Safie diffused happiness among its inhabitants, and I also found that a great degree of plenty reigned there. Felix and Agatha spent more time in amusement and conversation, and were assisted in their labors by servants. They did not appear rich, but they were contented and happy. Their feelings were serene and peaceful, while mine became every day more tumultuous. Increase of knowledge only discovered to me more clearly what a wretched outcast I was. I cherished hope, it is true, but it vanished when I beheld my person reflected in water, or my shadow in the moonshine, even as the frail image and that inconsistent shade. I endeavored to crush these fears and to fortify myself for the trials which in a few months I resolved to undergo, and sometimes I allowed my thoughts unchecked by reason to ramble in the field of paradise, and dared to fancy amiable and lovely creatures sympathizing with my feelings and cheering my gloom. Their angelic countenances breathed smiles of consolation. But it was a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows or shared my thoughts. I was alone. I remembered Adam's supplications to his Creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. Autumn passed thus. I saw, with surprise and grief, the leaves decay and fall, and nature again assume the barren and bleak appearance it had worn when I first beheld the woods and the lovely moon. Yet I did not heed the bleakness of the weather. I was better fitted to my conformation for the endurance of cold than heat. But my chief delights were to sight of the flowers, the birds, and all the gay apparel of summer. When those deserted me, I turned with more attention towards the cottagers. Their happiness was not decreased by the absence of summer. They loved and sympathized with one another, and their joys, depending on each other, were not interrupted by the casualties that took place around them. The more I saw of them, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. To see their sweet looks turned towards me with affection was the utmost limit of my ambition. I dared not think that they would turn them from me with disdain and horror. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. I asked, it is true, for greater treasures than a little food or rest. I required kindness and sympathy, but I did not believe myself utterly unworthy of it. The winter advanced, and an entire revolution of the seasons had taken place since I awoke into life. My attention at this time was solely directed towards my plan of introducing myself into the cottages of my protectors. I resolved many projects, but that on which I finally fixed was to enter the dwelling when the blind old man should be alone. I had sagacity enough to discover that the unnatural hideousness of my person was the chief object of horror with those who had formerly beheld me. My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it. I thought, therefore, that if, in the absence of his children, I could gain the good will of and meditation of the old de Lacy, I might by his means be tolerated by my younger protectors. One day, when the sun shone on the red leaves that strengthened the ground and diffused cheerfulness, although it denied warmth, Safie, Agatha, and Felix departed on a long country walk, and the old man, at his own desire, was left alone in the cottage. When his children had departed, he took up his guitar and played several mournful but sweet airs, more sweet and mournful than I had ever heard him play before. At first his countenance was illuminated with pleasure, but as he continued, thoughtfulness and sadness succeeded. At length, laying aside the instrument, he sat absorbed in reflection. My heart beat quick. This was the hour and moment of trial, which would decide my hopes or realize my fears. The servants were gone at the neighboring fair. All was silent in and around the cottage. It was an excellent opportunity, yet when I proceeded to execute my plan, my limbs failed, and I sunk to the ground, again rose, and, exerting all the firmness of which I was master, removed the plants which I had placed before my hovel to conceal my retreat. The fresh air revived me, and, with renewed determination, I approached the door of the cottage. I knocked. "Who is there?" said the old man. "Come in." I entered. "Pardon this intrusion," I said. "I am a traveler, in want of a little rest. You would greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire." "Enter," said De Lacy, "and I will try in what manner I can relieve your wants. But unfortunately my children are far from home, and as I am blind, I am afraid I shall find it difficult to procure food for you." "Do not trouble yourself, my kind host. I have food. It is warmth and rest only that I need." I sat down, and a silence ensued. I knew that every minute was precious to me, yet I remained irresolute in what manner to commence the interview, when the old man addressed me. "By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countryman. Are you French?" "No, but I was educated by French family, and understand that language only. I am now going to claim the protection of some friends whom I sincerely love, and of whose favor I have some hopes." "Are these Germans?" "No, they are French. But let us change the subject. I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around, and I have no relation or friends upon earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me, and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever." "Do not despair. To be friendless is indeed to be unfortunate, but the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Rely therefore on your hopes, and if these friends are good and amiable, do not despair." "They are kind. They are the most excellent creatures in the world, but unfortunately they are prejudiced against me, I have good dispositions. My life has been hitherto harmless and in some degree beneficial. But a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold only a detestable monster. That is indeed unfortunate. But if you are really blameless, cannot you undeceive them? I am about to undertake that task, and it is on that account that I feel so many overwhelming terrors. I tenderly love these friends. I have, unknown to them, been for many months in the habits of daily kindness towards them, but they believe that I wish to injure them, and it is that prejudice which I wish to overcome. Where do these friends reside? Near this spot. The old man paused and then continued. If you will unreservedly confide to me the particulars of your tale, I perhaps may be of use in undeceiving them. I am blind and cannot judge of your countenance, but there is something in your words which persuade me to you are sincere. I am poor and an exile, but it will afford me true pleasure to be in any way serviceable to a human creature. Excellent man, I thank you and accept your generous offer. You raise me from the dust of my kindness, and I trust that by your aid I shall not be driven from the society and sympathy of your fellow creatures. Heaven forbid, even if you were really criminal, for that can only drive you to desperation and not instigate you to virtue. I also am unfortunate. I and my family have been condemned, although innocent. Judge, therefore, if I not feel for your misfortune. How can I thank you, my best and only benefactor? From your lips first I have heard the voice of kindness directed towards me. I shall be forever grateful, and your present humanity assured me to success with those friends whom I am on the point of meeting. May I know the names and residence of those friends? I paused. This, I thought, was the moment of decision, which was to rob me of or bestow happiness on me forever. I struggled vainly for firmness sufficient to answer him, but the effort destroyed all my remaining strength. I sank on the chair and sobbed aloud. At the moment I heard the steps of my younger protectors. I had not a moment to lose, but seizing the hand of the old man, I cried, "Now it is time! Save and protect me. You and your family are the friends whom I seek. Do not you desert me in the hour of trial." "Great God!" exclaimed the old man. "Who are you?" At that instant, the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Safie, and Agatha entered. Who can describe the horror and consternation of beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Safie, unable to attend her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted towards me, and with supernatural force tore me from his father. to whose knees I clung. In a transport of fury, he dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb, as the lion rends the antelope, but my heart sunk within me with bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow, when, overcome by pain and anguish, I quitted the cottage, and in a general tumult escaped, unperceived, to my hovel. So, das war's wieder, meine Lieben. Schön, dass ihr da wart. Schlaft noch gut. Und bis zum nächsten Mal, wenn es wieder heißt Premium-Content und gute Nachtgeschichten. Nur hier bei eurem Docsbox Entertainment. Schlaft gut.